Hey everybody, John Peterson from John Peterson Photography, and I'm coming to you once again from my impromptu studio in our apartment as our house is getting rebuilt. So please excuse the disaster behind me. We're all still working from home, and wife and kids are out in the other room, and I am here with you. So, hang tight, and I'll show you some pretty pictures and hopefully distract you from the mess that's behind me. So today I wanted to talk about a recent trip that we took to the Oregon coast. We have a house over in Yachats, which is kind of in the central Oregon coast, and we go out there quite frequently with the family. And each time I'm out there, I take a moment and head out and do some photography. And I was really fortunate on this trip to take my oldest son out, who had a lot of questions and interest in photographing water motion. So we went to one of the local areas close by, and it was near on to high tide, and I worked with him on shooting some water motion of the ocean over the rocks, and it was a really productive time. Because I was more focused on A, keeping him safe, and B, teaching him how to shoot some of the photos that he wanted, I didn't spend a lot of time on my own photographs. However, I did manage to capture, 10 to 12 different frames, and I wanted to share a few of those with you and talk you through some of the processing in the digital darkroom, some of the logic that I use for how I process these pictures. There's a lot of instruction around how to do something, but too often people don't talk about why or what to do. You've got a great raw image sitting in front of you, and understanding how to step through the different processing steps that you want to do to achieve the vision is oftentimes one of the biggest hurdles for a lot of folks learning. So today, that's what I kind of wanted to do, is just walk you through a little bit of that exercise of how I approached this picture and what I did in the processing realm for it. So let's jump over to Photoshop and I'll show you what I'm talking about. All right, here is the first image I want to talk to you about, and this was shot real close to sunset. It's about 15 minutes before the actual sunset time. Just a little bit north of the town of Yachats. I'm actually running a workshop here next month, and really looking forward to showing this area. It's one of my favorite spots along the whole west coast. It's everything from rocky coastlines to wide sandy beaches, mountains going directly into the ocean. It's just a beautiful, varied landscape. So when we came up to this beach, I pointed out a few of the features to my son, and we were talking through different compositions, and this is one of the first areas that we settled on. And at this area, we tried to stay up above the high water mark for the waves. It's just so we don't get wet and get enough water motion coming over this rock shelf so we could play with this concept of photographing the water motion. And so this is one of the compositions that I picked out to process and talk to you guys about. Because of the steepness of the beach and the high tide, the water was moving really fast. And so I knew that I wanted a relatively fast shutter speed. And I was able to get about a 1.5 seconds shutter speed with this, shooting at f13. And I had to bump my ISO, though, up to 6400. So relatively high ISO for a lot of landscape work. But I wanted the water to be a particular style. I love water motion, but within that motion, I love to see the definition in the water. I like to see the streaks of foam, the shapes of the waves. I don't want complete cotton candy of the water, at least in a shot like this. And so I wanted a relatively fast shutter speed. This is the raw file, almost straight out of the camera. I brought it into Lightroom and just added a little texture to it, but really didn't do any adjustments in Lightroom. Instead, I choose to work mainly in Photoshop because of some of the tools that I have available. And I've spent, hundreds of hours learning Photoshop, and I don't want to give that up. So as I look at this image, the things that really strike me are the water, of course, in the foreground, and the beautiful sky. And so what I want to do with this is accentuate some of the colors and then also guide the viewer's eyes as best I can. Notice that I have some boundaries here. I've got the rocks on the left. I've got these 3 rocks that are visible. Got this rock right in the foreground, this really dark rock here, and then this curl wave over a rock, which is another dark spot. So I've got these bounding elements on either side of my composition. Then I've got this beautiful channel running straight out to the far back of the image. So the first thing I did with this is I added some mid-tone contrast. And you can, I'll talk about different edits that I do. You can do these in numerous different tools. Lightroom, Capture One, Photoshop. It really doesn't matter. I'm not preaching to use specific tools, but more the edits themselves and why I chose to do the particular edits that I do. I use Lightroom a lot for image catalogs and maybe some small, slight global adjustments, but then I come into Photoshop and do a lot of work with layers. And in particularly, I work a lot with the Tony Kuiper tonality mask tools to make edits in my image. And that was one of the ways I was able to do this first edit, is I added some mid-tone contrast. So using these tools, I was able to select a range of midtones and add a little bit of contrast. So right now it's off, and I'll turn it on right here. And you can see that instantly, so throughout this scene, there's a lot of midtones. I didn't want to block up the shadows any more than I had, and I didn't want to pop the highlights or the lights any more than I had. That's why I chose to just focus on the midtones, which is a lot of the clouds and a lot of the ocean. And so adding a mid-tone contrast instantly brings a little bit more depth, a little bit more dynamicism, and a little bit more color to the image. Can you see that? So there's with it, there's without it. It's flat, kind of lifeless. Just a little bit of mid-tone contrast does wonders. You can see, my curve isn't very abrupt or sharp. It's just a nice gentle S-curve in the mid-tone range. So I fiddled with that just a little bit and was able to make a really nice effect on the image. It was really starting to shape up. The next thing I did was really take a look at where I wanted the viewer's eyes to go. And as I shot this, and as I selected this once I got home, this ramp of water leading out to the ocean was really evident as a great point for the viewer to enter the image and then travel out into the far reaches of the frame. So I wanted to highlight these things. And you can do this in a variety of different tools. You can use the mask tool in Lightroom. You can use the white slider, even though the whites is fairly global, but I'll tend to use the mask and exposure in Lightroom. Or in Photoshop, I'll do my edits like this with a dodge tool. So a little, you've probably heard of dodge and burn. This is a dodge function where it puts a layer into my layer stack and selects the brush, and then I can start painting in where I want to dodge on the image. And I'm really doing this to brighten the water and to make it more of a focal point for the viewer's eyes to lock onto and travel out into the image. So this is without it, and this is with it. This is without it, and this is with it. It's very subtle. I'm not doing a lot of dramatic edits to this image. But what I'm doing is I'm brightening up this water right through here, this water element here, and then right into here. These 3 areas I brightened up with my dodge to give a little bit of a brighter focal point for the viewer's eyes to get into and then travel out into the image. So very, very light touch with this. You know, when I'm doing a dodge like this on my brush, I've got it set to about a 3% or 2% opacity, not very much at all. I like to build up my edit slowly over time and not go dramatically in the first pass. So very light touches on the opacity and light touches with the brush, built up that brush tool from that to that. And then lastly, you know, this is one of the easiest images, right? I've got 3 layers on here. I didn't do a lot of editing to this, but the last thing that I do for virtually every image is I'll add a vignette. And what the vignette does, you know, it darkens the borders of your frame. And what it does is it helps focus the viewers and subconsciously nudges them in towards the middle of the image so that they better appreciate and can see your subject. So this is without the vignette, and this is with it. Okay? Very subtle, without and with. And with the vignette on, it's really hard to tell in many cases that I've applied a vignette. I don't do this in a very heavy-handed way. Everything's natural and very subtle. So in 3 layers, you know, I went from that flat, not too colorful, into that. Very, very easy to do. So here's the next image from the exact same location. I had moved just a little bit over, about 10 feet over to the left, because I saw this really interesting kind of cascade of water happening, and I thought that could be a wonderful little foreground element. Let me turn off all my layers here real quick for you. And what I did is I put on a 10-stop ND filter, because in this case, for some reason I wanted to, not for some reason, I intentionally wanted to smooth out the water. So because I didn't want the ocean itself back here to take a lot of the interest, I wanted the viewer to focus more on the small waterfall and the cascade that I had going here. So I wanted to smooth out that water, so I threw on a 10-stop, composed this shot, and I ended up with a 9-second exposure. I shot this at f/22. I was using my Fujifilm GFX 50S, you know, and those lenses go up to f/32, and so f/22 is right in the meat of where this lens really performs well. I think I'd gone down to ISO 3200 or 2000, something a lot lower. But still, you know, I was trying to just really get it to the point of smoothing the water. So very similar to the other image where I've got some water in the foreground that I want to highlight. I've got some great color in the sky. The rocks in this image, at least in the foreground, are not quite as dark, so I have a lot of visual information. I have a lot of texture in them, and it's something that I will want to maybe pay attention to as I go through the edit. I've also got a lot of reflected color happening in these rocks, and that's something that I'll pay attention to as well as I go through the edits. So as you can see here, I've got just a couple more layers, but not a lot. You know, it's still a fairly simple adjustment. Again, I don't have to do anything really complex with my images to get them to a spot that I enjoy them. Just like the previous image, what I did here first was I added, again, a bit of mid-tone contrast. I wanted to leave the darks alone and leave the lights alone, but I wanted to add just a little bit of contrast, a little bit of pop in the mid-tone to bring some dynamics and depth into the shot. So this is with the mid-tone contrast, this is without it. This is with it, this is without it. You can see that the clouds get a little bit more defined, the water gets just a smidge darker, there's more color, there's a little bit more depth in the image. Okay, so mid-tone contrast, the first thing I did. Next thing I did is I again brought out my dodge tool because I want that water in this little drop-off in this channel to be one of the focal points of the image. So I really wanted to spend some time working on this. So I got out my dodge tool, probably a 3% opacity on the brush, and gradually just feathered in my dodge edits into the water to highlight this and really make it stand out and pop a little bit more. So here's without it, and here's with it. Without, in width. And you can see it really brought up the brightness of that, and without destroying the color of the water. All it did is it just sort of increased the exposure just a little bit in that range, but it really makes it a lot more prominent. As I was composing the shot, I was really cognizant of two things. Number one, where the water entered the frame over here on the right, and number two, how close I was to the bottom of the frame with this little swirly bit. Both of those things were very conscious choices for how I position this in my image. And to me, those are probably the two most important areas in the photograph to get right, and then the rest of the comp just sort of fell where it may. So after doing the mid-tone contrast, a little bit of dodge and burn, I started looking at some of the colors, knowing that the colors were, there's some vibrance that I'm leaving on the table here. The sky was a lot more vibrant than what I saw in my file. And so I went in and I did a little bit of a vibrance adjustment in the midtones, not the highlights or the shadows, because I didn't really want to adjust the color information in either the highlights or the shadows. It was really only the midtones, which is a lot of the sky and a little bit of the ocean water. So I added a slight vibrance layer. Very subtle. I don't know if you'll be able to pick it up on the video, but just a little bit of vibrance helped that color come through a little bit more. Next thing I did is I looked at the clouds in the sky and saw that there were some really beautiful dark clouds in the sky, or darker streaks, if you will. And I thought, you know what, right now the sky's looking a little bit flat. Is there a way that I can bring some dimensionality to those clouds? And one of the ways to do that is to burn. You know, just the opposite of dodge is burn, which is turning things darker. So I threw down a burn layer, and again, really light 2%, 1% opacity brush. I started brushing in some burn effects into the clouds. That's with it, and that's without it. Again, very subtle. But I wanted to darken up this streak, I wanted to darken up this corner, this big chunk of clouds, and then a little bit along the horizon. There's a lot of detail in there. And so I threw down just a quick burn tool in the sky. So I got this really where I wanted to go with just those edits. If I wanted to take it a little bit further, I could play with some of the colors in the foreground rocks and maybe take some of the magenta out of this, or some of the blue. But you know, for this demonstration, I really wanted to leave the rocks alone and just say, you know what, I got my contrast, I got depth, I got dimension, I got dynamic in the water, I got a great focal point with that cascade. Beautiful. So the only thing left that I need to do with this is to add a vignette, which is like that. So that's with the vignette, without the vignette, with the vignette, without the vignette. So you can see again, adding a little bit of depth with that vignette, focusing the eyes towards the middle of the frame. I think it just finishes off the image nicely. And then the last image I want to show you from this location and from this shooting event was this monochrome shot that I did. Same basic location. I had again repositioned myself because I saw this little shelf of rock right here would get submerged a lot with a big wave. And so my composition in my head, I was seeing all of these great layers. I saw this foreground rock, I saw this rock shelf, and I saw this rock. And then I saw this horizontal layer and this horizontal layer out there in the sky. So I had this wonderful repeating pattern going off throughout this entire composition. One of the great things about some of the Fujifilm cameras is on the JPEG files, you can shoot a film simulation. And this happens to be a JPEG that I used the Fuji Acros with a red filter. And it creates this beautiful emulation of the Fujifilm Acros film. And I like their recipe a lot. I also like the Nick Silver effects for doing monochrome work. Either one of those work great. But this is sort of the last image that I want to talk to you about. And this was I think a 3.5 second exposure the sun had gone down and it was getting fairly dark out. So it's about a 3.5 second exposure, I believe. Again, shooting at f16, and I think my ISO was around 200, so not super high. And I grabbed the JPEG out of the camera and did a quick process on this to show you, again, the steps that I looked for and looked at in processing this shot. Like I do for a lot of my images, mid-tone contrast. Give it a little punch. So that's with it and that's without it. The reason, again, midtones is I didn't want to block up. There's a lot of dark tones down here in the rocks. I didn't want to block these up any further than they already were. And so I wanted to just focus my edits in the midtone. You can see instantly that the sky got a little bit darker. Sky's all sorts of midtones in the sky, as well as the ocean. Ocean got a little darker, and then the sea foam on top got a little bit brighter. So I got some great contrast through a large part of the image, which is fantastic. I think it adds a little bit more drama, and it adds a little bit more dynamic feel to the image with that. Next thing I did as I was processing this in my first take was I looked at the foreground rocks and thought, you know what, I might want to brighten them just a smidge. So I did a brightness and contrast layer just in the foreground, and I masked it off and then painted the adjustment back in. That's without it, that's with it. Without it and with it. And it's really kind of down to a personal preference what you like. I wanted just a little bit more visual information in it. And the reason being is that when I have elements in the foreground of the image, and that's where I want the viewer to come into my shot, I want them to not be puzzled over what it is they're seeing right in the foreground. Because subconsciously, we're standing on that ground. As I view this image, I'm standing on that ground. And if I don't know what I'm standing on, I get uneasy. And so when I have foreground elements like this, I want the viewer to easily recognize what it is so that they have comfort to know that their point of view is on solid ground. And so I tend to like a little bit more information in the foreground. And so that's why I brightened up these rocks in the foreground. Next thing I did is I took a look at the sky and thought, you know what, there's a lot more drama in the sky. One of the best ways to bring that out, other than contrast, is with a burn layer. And so that's what I did here. I applied a burn layer to this. That's without it, and that's with it. Very subtle, small adjustments. There's with it, there's without it, there's with it. I just wanted a little bit more visual weight, because darker things are perceived heavier. I wanted some more visual weight. I wanted some more depth. I didn't want this flat 2D sky up there. I wanted to create some visual depth in it. And so one way to do that is kind of dodge and burn and have highlights and dark areas. And that creates this perception of depth. And so that's one way to get rid of the flat sky, was to throw a little burn in it. And then last but not least, a vignette, a very slight vignette. There's without it, and there's with it. So in just a couple of adjustment layers, you can see I went from that, which is, a nice photograph in and of itself, to that, which I feel is a whole lot better. So there you go, folks. Just a little discussion about how I approach some of my shots and why I choose to do the edits that I do for a scene like this. Now, if I was in the desert or shooting waterfalls or out in the Palouse, my editing steps would be very, very different. The things that are generally the same, though, are a vignette at the end, and I generally do a little bit of mid-tone contrast in the middle. But other than that, all the other edits are really image dependent. So if you have any questions, feel free to drop a comment below. If you are not subscribed to this channel, please feel free to do so. I love your support. Thanks for watching, and I'll talk to you again soon. Bye-bye.